happy to hear that you're already a little bit into psychedelics, which is my topic, which I should talk about, and I should give you a little overview. That's what I was asked, an overview about the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. I'm working at Czech National Institute of Mental Health near Prague, and we also founded a new CIRES Foundation that supports psychedelic research, and also I'm presenting Czech Psychedelic Society in here. So, very briefly, something you probably know when we speak about psychedelics, we know these compounds or these substances are also called hallucinogens, but psychedelics is probably a more appropriate term because it describes their manifesting the inside of our soul, their soul manifesting. You can also meet other terms in the literature and psychiatric research. We always frequently use the term psychotomimetic because they are known to induce psychotic symptoms. Their intoxication or the altered states of consciousness they produce is very similar to what we know from psychosis like schizophrenia. Entheogens speak about or describe its relation to spirituality, fantastica to fantastic imagery that they can induce. What psychedelics are, has lots of substances and lots of natural and synthetic compounds which we can put or hide under the name of psychedelics. In general, the most known psychedelics are so-called classical serotonergic psychedelics because they share the common mechanism of action, acting on serotonin system in the brain. And from these is definitely the most known LSD, then psilocybin, which is found in psychedelic mushrooms, mescaline found in the cacti, peyote and San Pedro, DMT in ayahuasca, 5-meo DMT in Bufo alvarius, secret, and so on, and lots of synthetic ones which are very powerful. The second important group from in relation to the therapeutic use are dissociative anesthetics. As the title says, these compounds are used as an anesthetics in humans. Most known is ketamine, which is used till these days. But relatively recently, it has been found that it has some interesting therapeutic properties, and therefore my talk will focus mainly on these classical serotonergic psychedelics and dissociative anesthetics like ketamine. So when we go to past, psychedelics were in almost every country around the globe for thousands of years. They were used for ritual and healing purposes. And now, in the short period of Westerners' interest in psychedelics, like these 100 years approximately, you're trying to find out something that's probably known for these cultures for thousands of years, either with psychedelic mushrooms containing psilocybin, with San Pedro cacti containing mescaline, or ayahuasca with DMT. So, very briefly, what are the effects of psychedelics? These compounds induce an altered state of consciousness, and as they have the alternate name hallucinogens, it is obvious they should induce some perceptual effects. Typically, they induce visual perceptual effects like hallucinations, pseudo-hallucinations, or synesthesia. Synesthesia means that, for example, you can see music or see sounds. So this is why people usually experience them. But they also have very profound psychological effects, which can vary from very positive experience, ecstatic states, mystical experiences, up to very anxious-like and psychotic experiences. They also have some somatic effects. They are agents that act on several neurotransmitter systems. Since they act on the neurotransmitter systems like serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline, they can induce so-called sympathomimetic effect, which is represented by increased heart rate, increased blood pressure typically. And they can also induce states of nausea and vomiting. And some cultures, they believe this is a cleansing effect of psychedelics. It's usually nothing dangerous, but it's present and it's related to their pharmacological mechanism of action, by the way. So, how they affect our brain in order to produce these traumatic effects. Very briefly, very simplistically, when we speak about the serotonergic psychedelics, they act on one particular serotonin receptor, which is called serotonin 2A receptor. They are stimulating this receptor. When we speak about ketamine, it's a blocker of glutamatergic NMDA receptor. Nevertheless, these receptors are widely presented in the brain areas like cortex and subcortical regions. And in fact, they finally do the same thing. In the brain, we have something what we call cortex. That's a part of the brain that is responsible for our mental processes, for cognition, and for everything that we do cognitively. Then we have subcortical structures where thalamus is a very important component, which plays a role like a filter. It filters the information that the cortex should process and tells us actually what is relevant, where we should focus our attention and where not. And what happens during the psychedelic state, that psychedelics, nevertheless, which mechanism is there, they increase cortical excitability and they just block the thalamic filter. So at the same time, the brain cortex work on 300%, and we got much more information coming into the cortex, and there's much more information processed. And that might be a cause why we perceive the reality in a different way, why we perceive at the same time internal processes that are coming from inside, from outside, and why we are not able to focus our cognition on almost anything. So the psychedelics lead the experience themselves. We are not able to control the psychedelic experience. So this is a little bit about the acute effects, the introduction, but my talk is about the therapeutic potential. So they were used for thousands of years by other cultures, and we speak about the short time window when we, Westerners, try to use psychedelics. But let's go a little bit to the past. Around 50s, there were in psychiatry, there was nothing available to treat psychiatric disorders. There was a little bit, some attempts to use psychoanalysis to treat psychiatric disorders, but it doesn't work in many cases. And at the time psychedelics appeared, people thought, yes, these compounds have very powerful effects, so they might be useful in treating psychiatric disorders. If you look on the studies that were performed at the time, there would be many unethical these days. But you have to take it in line with the thing that there's lots of discoveries around that time. And the first antipsychotics and first antidepressants were also discovered around the same time where psychedelics were tested in patients. So it is understandable that they were studied as potential tools for treatment, and there were errors done, like they were used to treat schizophrenics, where they can worsen the symptoms, and they're today contraindicated in these subset of patients. Nevertheless, there were some areas where it has been found that psychedelics might have a good potential. First one is addiction. There's a recent review published on the effects of LSD, studies reviewed from the 60s and 70s, how whether LSD can be beneficial to treat addictions or not. You don't have to read the whole studies, but the amazing information is that it's almost twice as more effective than any placebo that was used. So yes, LSD seems to be very effective in treating addictions in control design already from the 60s. More recently, the first ketamine control, the first psychedelic-assisted therapy for addiction was performed with ketamine by Evgen Krupitsky in Russia in heroin addicts. And what he found that ketamine-assisted psychotherapy increased the abstinence rates in heroin users. And not only the abstinence rates, but something which is very important, and it's reduction of craving. Craving is a key symptom of addiction, which usually leads to relapse within years after discontinuation of the drug, within years after treatment. So there is something which we can call an anti-craving therapy induced by psychedelics. More recently, the study, the effects of ketamine addiction were replicated in cocaine addicts, and Carl Hart and his team showed that ketamine decreased consumption of cocaine and decreased craving in cocaine users. The other compound which is intensively studied in these days in addiction is psilocybin, the one from psychedelic mushrooms. This is the first study that was published. It's for smoking cessation. I don't know how many of you smoked and tried to quit, but it's something very difficult. And what they found that up to 67%, 12 months after they entered the therapy, were still abstinent, and 16 months after, 60%. And they did it quite scientifically because they controlled for the carbon oxide levels, they controlled for cotinine levels, which is the metabolite of nicotine in the urine. They controlled for the number of cigarettes smoked per day. And what they found out, additionally, that the better outcome depended on the fact that the more mystical experience the subject had, the better outcome in terms of abstinence rates they had in the future. By the way, this is reality without any support, how many people can quit smoking. So this is absolutely tremendous or amazing how many people, 5% versus 67% with psilocybin-assisted therapy. So this is evidence-based that psychedelics might have an effect. There are other studies, including ayahuasca, including ibogaine, including psilocybin in other treatment modalities. The other area where psychedelics seems to be effective is something that was called neurosis in the past, but it's anxiety-related disorders and depression and existential distress. Existential distress is something that appears when people are confronted with a terminal illness diagnosis, with an end-stage cancer, for example. There's no way they will die. And it seems that psychedelics might or have an effect in this area. The first study that was, controlled study that was done by the team of Rhonda Griffiths and Grob in the US, and they found that psilocybin decreased the anxiety and decreased depressive symptoms of these patients. And later on, the same thing was found for LSD. It is clear that these studies were quite the first ones, because if you want to make a study with an unregistered compound like a psychedelic and you want to use it in patients, you will probably not be allowed to go to patients where there is another treatment strategy which is effective. But when there is no effective strategy, then compounds like psychedelics can be used, and that's why these were most likely the first studies. But subsequently, it has been found something that psychedelics might have an antidepressant effect. And today we speak, or all scientific literature focuses their attention on something which is called fast-acting antidepressants. Antidepressants that switch the mood, and they turn depressive patient to a normophoric patient. In fact, most of these compounds are psychedelics. There are also others like nitric oxide and so on, but most of them are psychedelics. And the most evidence also comes from the past. You don't have to read this, but this is just an example. These are studies from the history when they were examined, and as you can see, LSD and mescaline was effective in treating depression in rates 40 to 91% of patients, and several times after one dose. Do you know how classical antidepressants are taken? They're taken per day continuously, and the effect appears within 3 to 8 weeks of continuous treatment of the corresponding dose. And about 30% of patients respond to the first-line treatment, and the rest, 30% to second-line treatment, and the rest are pharmacoresistant patients. They do not respond to anything. If you take it time-wise, the patients suffer for months before they might get some relief from the depressive symptoms. And here, with psychedelics, after one dose, it seems there might be an antidepressive effect. The most known is ketamine, because it's a compound that is available which is registered as a pharmaceutical compound. And as you can see here, this is a drop in depressive symptoms after intravenous infusion of sub-anesthetic dose, which is the psychedelic dose. And the depressive symptoms disappear on the first day, but unfortunately, within 7 to 10 days, they are getting back to the previous state. So there is not maintenance of the antidepressant effect, which is something people are studying a lot now. But let's have a look further. Janssen pharmaceutical company produced S-ketamine intranasal, which is now registered on the market to be applied to patients. But the administration is quite complicated. It has to be done in specific centers under supervision, so it's very costly, and the price of the S-ketamine is very expensive as well. So the question is how it will work in the future. But let's have a look on something that appeared later on. This is a study done by Robin Garhard Harris with psilocybin in treatment-resistant patients. And they received 2 doses of psilocybin, one low, 10 milligrams, and then high, 25 milligrams. And 1 week after the session, most of the subjects were at least were completely remitted, or some with a response. But as you see here, the effect persisted for 3 months. 1 or 2 doses, 1 full psychedelic, and 3 months of effect, something we never saw from standard treatments. And when they did a follow-up, it wasn't only 3 months, it was 6 months as well. That led to the fact that there are companies that are interested now in the use of psychedelics in the treatment of depression. And there's a big trial ongoing now, led by Compass Company, multicentric trial in treatment-resistant depression with psilocybin. And again, this is not only the case for psilocybin, but ayahuasca seems to have the same effects. But why I show this slide is that in the study, for the first time, they admitted that the patients who were enrolled are also patients who suffer personality disorders, which is a nightmare for most of the psychotherapies and very difficult to treat by current recent approaches. So this is a print screen from clinical trials, a page where all clinical studies are registered. And this is the recent count of studies which involve psilocybin, official clinical trials running with psilocybin in different conditions, healthy patients and so on. And there is a similar amount of the others, LSD, MDMA, ayahuasca, ibogaine. So this points out the importance of renaissance of the psychedelic research. So what's underlying this amazing mechanisms of action? We don't know for sure, but there are definitely 3 domains. One is something which we call neuroplasticity. The other one is that psychedelics might change the functional brain state. And the third one is definitely they might interact with the psychological mechanisms that were underlying the disorder. When we go for the first one, for the neuroplasticity, our brain consists of billions of neurons, and they're interconnected one with the other. And the more connections, what we know from depression, that there's decrease in number of connections between these neurons. And what we know, what has been shown, that psychedelics, serotonergic psychedelics as well as ketamine, they increase the number of connections between these cells, so they restore the deficit that was produced by the depression, which is toxic to the brain connectivity, to the structural connectivity. So that's one of the things. There's some structural thing. The other thing is like the functional state of our brain. If you look not on depression, but on bipolar disorder, manio-depressivity, people can switch from one state, being depressed, to another state, being manic, within few hours if they're rapid cycles. So that means the brain can switch from different states, completely opposite directions, within minutes or days. And that's probably not related only to neuroplasticity. So there's lots of ongoing research using the neuroimaging methods that the brain can exist in very different conditions. And this is a famous image from Robin's study, placebo-conditioned psilocybin, which increased dramatically the chaos in the brain connectivity of all the structures. And Robin hypothesized that depression is a rigid state, and psilocybin does that. It switches it through high entropy state, high connectivity state, to another more flexible state in which the brain can operate and can deal with the depressive symptoms. So switching from one functional state to another one might be also an underlying factor. The other things are psychological aspects. We know that depression can be related to trauma and long-term stress and so on. But there's one thing people in pharma business call that the psychedelic effects of psychedelics are unwanted or adverse effects. And this is a study that we've ran on our patients, depressed patients with ketamine. They were administered intravenous ketamine, and they split to 2 groups, responders and non-responders. Mothers is a scale which refers to the antidepressant effect, and BPR is a scale that we examine subjects during the intoxication and can measure the intensity of psychotomimetic effect of ketamine. And what we have found out is correlation that the more psychotic-like experience subjects had during the experience, the better antidepressant response had. So it's very likely that the psychedelic experience per se could be an important factor that contributes to the antidepressant effects of psychedelics. And indeed, this is a graph from Robin's study in patients. The red line are non-responders, blue are responders. If you see responders, they had much more blissful state and mystical and spiritual-like experiences compared to the non-responders, which has much more anxiety. The responders has very low levels of anxiety. We're coming with this to a question, set and setting. Set as the mindset with which the subject enters into the treatment and setting, or into the session, psychedelic session, and setting the environment where they take the substance or the medicine. This is a typical environment that is used in John Hopkins by Ron Griffiths. Sofa, person is laying with eye shades, two therapists or two sitters staying with the subject throughout the experience. This is our lab or our place where we perform psychedelic psychedelic studies and psychedelic therapy. So this is a controlled setting based on some experiences from the past. But what is this? This is a traditional setting for ayahuasca rituals. This is Hunikui, indigenous village in Tehran, where they perform ayahuasca ceremonies. And this is Ashaninka Maloka from Mayantuyacu in Peru. And actually, we are interested recently in how the set and setting and the traditional context might influence the potential antidepressant-like effects. Because when you spoke to indigenous people about psychiatric disorders, they say, we don't understand you. We don't know what's psychiatric disorder. We don't know what's schizophrenia or depression. And we just live with the nature, and we ask ayahuasca or nishipe or whatever they call it to heal us. So what we decided to do, a bit crazy study, we want to record volunteers with EEG. We want to use psychometric scales to measure the effects on well-being, nature-relatedness, interpersonal relatedness during the ceremonies in a traditional environment, not in the neo-shamanic environment, but in the traditional environment with indigenous people down there in the Amazon. And we got a funding for that from Neuron Foundation, and we already did some preparative steps. And we went to the Amazon, and I'll show you a 5-minute video, and then I will comment a little bit on it so you have an idea what we are currently doing.
They are leaders from the people in the Amazon. And we brought them to see the neuroscience lab and how we study the brain under the effect of ayahuasca and similar substances.
Eksperymenty zajmowały ale uczestników uwolnionych aspektualnych w ceremonii.
Se nós acreditássemos 100% que isso não é bom, eu não estaria aqui nem outro comigo.
Były proszoskie atmosfery, wspólne mieliśmy schizofrenię.
Massive rise in mental disorders in people, they lose connection with the meaning of life. This indigenous knowledge can be really, really relevant.
A ayahuasca, ela é capaz de curar a mente humana, de fazer essa limpeza.
Jest nas trošku přizpůsobit tomu, aby to psilocybe trošku připomínalo to harmonické.
Para harmonizar tudo isso, para chegar num entendimento, para juntar esses conhecimentos e beneficiar alguém.
We are hopeful that by putting these two systems of knowledge to work together, everybody can gain a lot.
medicina, medicina,
That's rapé, by the way, the tobacco. Hunniqui are famous for their really good and strong rapé. Can I switch to the next slide? So we were there. It was an amazing preparative phase. We showed to indigenous people how EEG works because they are afraid of doing this. If I can have 3 more minutes, it would be great. And we got an approval from the whole Hunniqui tribe and from Meister Juan to perform this study. So just a very last slide. This is actually the altered state of consciousness scale describing the effects of psilocybin in our laboratory setting and of ayahuasca, because we did drink ayahuasca several times in there and we evaluated ourselves. And what we see here, the experience looks pretty much the same, the shape of this experience. There's like the positive effects, blissful state, and so on. This is the imaginary visual effects. And this small tiny thing is anxiety. There's also no anxiety. So both settings in our lab with psilocybin and ayahuasca were quite safe. Psilocybin seemed to be a little bit more intense. And this is a Robin study. Look at it. Those who responded to to psilocybin as an antidepressant had very low levels of anxiety. maybe a little bit more than we did. So definitely the two settings we use in our lab and in the Amazon were quite safe. And this is the first outcome we have from this study. And this is something I would like to finish with my talk. We have this Psychedelic Research Foundation where we want to support different research. One is psilocybin versus ketamine in depression. The other one is the ayahuasca study that I mentioned. And we're planning to also introduce an app to monitor the acute and long-term effects of psychedelics, which are used in non-controlled setting. And I would like to thank to all collaborators from the team. Thank you for the attention. And if anyone would like to support any of this research, you can go to our website. So thank you very much for your attention.